The men who mocked Elijah Hart called him a fool behind his back. Some did it to his face in quieter ways, through smirks and raised brows when they passed his property along the eastern rise, just outside the town limits of Bitterwind. Others laughed at the supply orders he made at the general store. 50 pounds of iron nails, dozens of metal brackets, timber beams shaped to custom size, sheets of metal roofing heavier than needed, and strange bolts he had to explain were for reinforcement, not hinges. Some just didn't understand why a widowed rancher in his 50s, with no sons and no hired help, would spend every waking hour reinforcing a barn that hadn't held livestock in 2 winters. It wasn't that Elijah was disliked. He was quiet, decent, and had paid his debts. He didn't drink in town, didn't cause trouble, and had kept to himself since the fever took his wife 3 years earlier. Most folks pitied him in that passive way people do, glancing over, saying, "Poor man," then going about their day. But when he started rebuilding his barn with a stubbornness that bordered on obsession, the pity turned to suspicion. He had no cattle, no horses, not even pigs anymore. The old barn, if fixed up modestly, would have served well enough for storage. But Elijah tore it down, beam by beam, salvaging what he could, and began raising a structure no one could understand. They said he was grieving in his own way. They said he was wasting money. They said he was preparing for a war that wasn't coming. And maybe in some corner of his mind, Elijah thought he was too, because the man who set out to rebuild his barn wasn't doing it to store hay or feed or tools. He was doing it to make sure that what had happened once could never happen again. What no one in Bitterwind knew, what no one could know, was that Elijah Hart had seen something the others hadn't. He had lived through a night 2 winters before that changed him in ways he never spoke about. It had nothing to do with cattle rustlers or bandits, not even with wolves, though that was the easiest lie to tell when someone asked why he kept his rifle in reach even when chopping wood. No, Elijah had seen men that night, men with quiet boots and sharp eyes who didn't act like desperate thieves or hungry raiders, men who moved with purpose, who weren't there to steal cattle, but to test something. They didn't break into the house, they never approached it, but they circled the barn, knocked on its planks, pulled on the door, walked the perimeter in silence. Then, before sunrise, they left. Nothing taken, no message left, just a warning Elijah felt in his marrow. He never told the sheriff. What could he say? That strangers had walked around his barn and didn't steal anything, that they had tapped on it like inspectors. He sounded crazy even to himself, but he knew what he'd seen, and worse, what he'd felt in his gut. Whatever those men were testing, they'd decided his barn wasn't worth it that time, so he tore it down, because he knew they'd come back, and next time they wouldn't walk away, not if they thought it was easy. So Elijah Hart started building the kind of structure no sane man builds on the plains, unless he's expecting a siege. He didn't care if they laughed. Let them laugh. He'd already buried the only person who ever mattered to him. The rest of it, reputation, appearances, town gossip, none of it weighed more than a feather. The new barn didn't rise quickly. Elijah worked alone. He didn't hire help, didn't explain what he was doing, didn't draw blueprints anyone could follow. But the changes were visible. The frame was thicker, denser. He used old telegraph poles where others would have used pine. He set the beams into stone footings sunk deep into the frozen soil. He welded steel plates into the main support joints. And the doors, those were the first thing people noticed. They weren't barn doors anymore. They were repurposed vault slabs, salvaged from a collapsed rail station 3 counties over. Each one took 4 men to move, but Elijah hung them alone, using a system of pulleys and wedges he'd rigged up himself. It took him 6 days. When they shut, they didn't thud. They sealed. At night, he worked by lamplight. During the day, when the ranch should have echoed with the hammer of industry or the bustle of livestock, it was silent except for the creak of timbers being shifted and the occasional grind of metal against metal. More than once, someone rode past and saw him installing something they couldn't explain. Metal crossbars braced against the inside of the walls, narrow slits cut high under the eaves, too small to be windows, too deliberate to be mistakes. A traveler once asked at the tavern if there was a militia forming out near Bitterwind. Folks laughed, but even as they did, some of the men who had watched Elijah work began to wonder if the old rancher had seen something they hadn't. Then came the storm. It was the kind of blizzard that sealed roads and shuttered doors. 3 days of howling wind and sideways snow, ice forming on the insides of windows, animals freezing where they stood. Most families in Bitterwind huddled by their hearths and prayed the roof wouldn't give. And while the rest of the town was buried in drifts, Elijah Hart's property stood like a dark silhouette against the white. No chimney smoke, no lights, no movement. When the storm cleared and people began to dig out, someone rode out to check on Elijah. Not out of concern exactly, more curiosity. But they found the house empty. The barn, however, was locked tight. No footprints led away. They knocked, waited, no answer. The man who'd ridden out circled the barn, saw no signs of life, no damage, nothing disturbed. But he swore later, overwhelmed, whiskey and under his breath that he'd heard something shift behind the walls, something heavy, something slow. 2 days later, Elijah reappeared in town, alive, unfrostbitten, tired but intact. When someone asked where he'd holed up during the storm, he only said, "Didn't trust the house." That was all he ever said about it. But from then on, the laughter changed. Fewer folks joked about Elijah's barn. Some still called him eccentric, but others started to ask quiet questions. Why the slits near the roof? What was that sound inside? Why not the house? And that's when the rumors began. That Elijah Hart wasn't just reinforcing a barn, that he was preparing for something, that maybe, just maybe, he knew something was coming, because the truth hadn't changed. Elijah had never explained the night 2 winters ago, never told what he'd seen, but he remembered the way they tested his walls, the way they moved, the way they left without a trace, and he had spent every hour since making sure they wouldn't find an easy mark when they returned. The question wasn't if they'd come again, it was whether the stronghold he'd built would hold. Elijah Hart never called it a barn again, not out loud, and not in the journals he began keeping in the months that followed the storm. The townspeople still used the word barn, but Elijah referred to it only as the structure, sometimes the hold, never barn. A barn was where you kept animals. A barn had vulnerabilities, gaps in the roof for light and air, thin doors you could shoulder open with enough weight, ventilation that invited in drafts, or worse, people. A barn invited entry. Elijah wasn't building something to welcome in cows, he was building something to keep the outside out, permanently if necessary. The morning after his return to town following the storm, Elijah went straight to the hardware merchant and ordered another 20 pounds of square nails and 3 locking mechanisms no one in Bitterwind had ever seen before, imported from the east, supposedly used on secure cargo trains. He also asked about a shipment of tallow-soaked canvas and heavy wire mesh. When the shopkeeper asked what he was planning to use them for, Elijah simply replied, "Insulation." By now, people had stopped asking why. His reputation had shifted. He wasn't just the grieving widower anymore. He was something else, a man who knew something or feared something, and was preparing in ways the rest of them couldn't comprehend. And there's a special kind of unease that settles in a frontier town when someone who looks like you and lives like you suddenly starts acting like the world's about to end. Because if Elijah Hart was crazy, then everyone could breathe easy. But if he wasn't, there were whispered theories that he'd seen raiders massing across the ridge, that he'd found evidence of an outlaw gang using the wilderness to stage attacks, that he was preparing for war. A few even believed the more far-fetched stories, that Elijah had seen something unnatural in the woods, and he wasn't building a stronghold to keep people out, but to keep something else in. Elijah didn't answer questions. He worked. Every day after that storm, he returned to the structure and continued adding layers of protection. He'd already completed the main frame and sealed it with thick logs cut to spec and treated with a mixture of oil and pitch to resist rot and insects. But that had only been phase 1. He'd spent the long winter nights drawing sketches in a ledger, diagrams of force distribution, airflow, visibility lines. He'd taught himself rudimentary geometry to calculate angles and blind spots. He wasn't just reinforcing a barn, he was studying defense. By mid-spring, the additions began to look less like barn work and more like fortification. The corners of the structure had been fitted with outward-angled buttresses, log stacks braced with metal struts that deflected wind, but more importantly resisted impact. The upper rafters were double-braced. The eaves extended just far enough to prevent snow buildup but were shallow enough to prevent climbing. Elijah dug trenches around the outer walls, drainage, officially, but he also laid broken stone and shards of rusted iron at the bottom, the kind of thing that'd twist ankles or worse if crossed in haste. Inside, he added a second layer of walls. The outer structure was already formidable, but Elijah knew what the men from that long-ago winter had tried, testing gaps, prodding joints, knocking at corners. So he built a false wall inside the first, 12 inches of dead space packed with dried earth, ash, and metal mesh. If someone, or something, tried to breach the outer wall, they'd hit the equivalent of a blast cushion. It wouldn't just stop them, it would confuse them. By time, he left nothing to chance. Every ventilation slit had a hidden shutter made from overlapping steel strips riveted to hardwood. They slid into place on tracks Elijah had fashioned himself from wagon axles. Each one could be opened for airflow or sealed in a heartbeat. Light came only through controlled shafts, tunnel-like structures set into the walls at angles that made it impossible to see inside from the outside, but allowed a clear view from within if needed. Every opening, no matter how small, was designed to close and lock. People who caught glimpses of the inside, very few did, but the rare visitor or wandering supplier who stepped inside was stunned. The floor was stone, not dirt. The walls were notched with gear hooks, lantern holders, and slits for firearms. There was a hatch in the floor leading to a sub-level dug directly into the earth, reinforced with cribbing so dense it resembled a mine shaft more than a cellar. One boy who peeked in while Elijah wasn't looking swore he saw something like a hand crank affixed to the wall, next to what looked like a small pipe leading into the floor. No one believed him, but the story made its rounds, and beneath it all was a logic that no one could deny. Elijah Hart wasn't building in madness. He was building with purpose. Everything fit together, functioned, reinforced. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The question kept circling back, unspoken. For what? That summer, a drifter came through Bitterwind, said his name was Cooper, claimed to be traveling west, chasing rumors of a new mining camp. He was lean, polite, sharp-eyed, talked to everyone, asked questions, normal ones mostly, about weather, terrain, routes, but also about Elijah. He lingered around the outskirts of town longer than he should have, never caused trouble, but folks noticed he walked past Elijah's land more than once. Just walking, he said, taking in the view. But Elijah noticed too. That night the lights inside the structure stayed on till well past midnight. The drifter left 2 days later. 3 days after that, Elijah installed a new system of locks on the structure's main entrance. 3-tiered latches, keyed differently, recessed into the frame so they couldn't be accessed without the precise tool set. He also began building something low and angular at the southern side. Looked like a shed at first, but it had no door, just a slope, reinforced sides, and a pipe that disappeared into the ground. Someone asked what it was. Elijah said, "Vent." When pressed, he added nothing. And then the second incident happened, late August. A heat wave had settled over the prairie, and most of Bitterwind lay restless in their beds when it happened. A sound, distant, sharp, metallic, like something striking metal. Once, then again. People said it came from Elijah's land, but by the time anyone looked it was over. No fire, no shouting, no gunfire, just silence. The next morning Elijah rode into town with a bruise across his cheekbone and dried blood on his collar. When asked, he said he'd slipped moving timber. No one believed it. That afternoon, 2 men went to check on his property. Called out, no answer. Circled the structure. The doors were closed, the grounds undisturbed. But they found something odd. A patch of scorched earth about 10 feet from the western wall. Not fire damage, more like a flash. The grass blackened in a circular pattern. No embers, no ash, just a mark, like something had gone off. Briefly, violently, and vanished. They left without knocking again. After that, no one questioned Elijah's orders. When he came to town for more supplies, this time it was copper wire, lengths of chain, and 2 pounds of powdered lime, people sold him what he needed and kept their questions to themselves. They'd started to believe what Elijah had suspected all along, that something was coming, and that when it did, the only place worth being was behind the walls of that strange reinforced barn built by a man they once called a fool. But Elijah wasn't preparing to let anyone in. The stronghold was built for one. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was grief, maybe it was fear, so deep it no longer had a name. But whatever force drove him, it was as steady as it was silent. Every nail driven, every beam set, every trap laid, it all came back to that one night, 2 winters ago, when something tested his walls and found them wanting. They hadn't come to kill, not then. They had come to measure. And Elijah Hart had spent every day since making sure that if they returned, they'd find their measurements had changed. The days grew shorter, and with them came a quiet shift in Elijah Hart's posture. He no longer looked like a man preparing. He looked like a man waiting. The mountains to the west turned blue and violet in the cold air, streaked with the golden blaze of dying leaves, and Bitterwind settled into the rhythm of another high plains autumn. The town's attention returned to the usual. Hunting, preserving, bracing for early snow. Children helped their fathers patch roofs and check root cellars. Mothers stitched blankets and mended coats by the hearth. But the story of Elijah's stronghold still circled in half whispers. They said the rancher was sleeping in the barn now, that his house sat empty, unused, curtains drawn tight. They said you could see the light of oil lanterns burning all night through the slats of those strange angled vents. Some claimed they'd heard hammering after dark, slow, deliberate, like a man timing every strike. Others swore they heard no sound at all, just silence where life should have been. That was the part that unnerved them most. Not the building itself, not even Elijah's strange behavior. It was the silence. What they didn't see, what no one could see, was the interior transformation that had turned the barn into something else entirely. Elijah had hollowed out the floor in a square pattern, leaving a raised perimeter for movement and stability, then reinforced the cutout basin with stone slabs he'd dragged from a creek bed 8 miles away. These weren't decoration. They served as both flooring and passive thermal defense. Beneath that basin, hidden even from someone inside the structure unless they knew where to look, was the sublevel, his last line of retreat. A space carved directly into the earth, low-ceilinged, cold and tight, barely enough for a man to move in crouched posture. But it was strong. Every surface was lined in layered timber, overlapping metal plates, and sandbags stacked in triple rows. One entrance only, a vertical shaft, sealed from above by a pressure-latched hatch disguised beneath a rug. That sub-level, Elijah knew, was where he'd make his last stand, if it ever came to that. And that's exactly what he was preparing for. He didn't write about it plainly in his journal. The few entries that survived from those weeks were maddeningly vague. They spoke of signals, of shadows returning to old ground. And one entry scrawled without punctuation read simply, "They walk in shoes, but not like us. They test wood, they test metal next time they bring fire." Whatever truth Elijah carried, he carried it alone, but he never wavered in his purpose. By early October, the stronghold had entered its final phase. Elijah began testing it like a fortress commander would, checking angles of defense, timing how long it took to seal each vent and shutter, running silent drills in the dark to reach the hatch, pull shut the entrance bolts, prime the lanterns, unroll the blackout tarps. The barn, once an open space for livestock, had become a multi-level defensive redoubt. The roof, shingled in double-layered tin sheeting nailed over hardwood planks, had a hidden crawl space accessible only by ladder. In that crawl space, Elijah stored not hay but ballast, hundreds of pounds of rock and iron chunks held in suspended nets. A simple pulley system could release them in an instant. The weight wasn't for attack, it was for collapse. If compromised, Elijah could pull a lever and bring the ceiling down on anyone inside. The man had prepared for every contingency, except perhaps for company, because that was when the girl arrived. It was the second week of October. She came on foot, in boots too thin for the season, with a scarf wrapped over her face and a pack slung over one shoulder. No one knew her name at first. No one had seen her before. She came through Bitterwind like a shadow, didn't stop at the general store, didn't speak at the tavern, just walked straight down the main road, crossed the bridge, and followed the ridgeline path toward Elijah Hart's land. A farmer's boy saw her from a hilltop and ran to tell his father. By the time anyone thought to follow, she was gone. Later, some claimed Elijah must have known her, that she was family or kin by marriage, but no one could verify that. And when the town sheriff rode out to check 2 days later, Elijah met him at the edge of his property, rifle in hand, and said no one was there but him. That was enough for the sheriff. He didn't press further, but the girl was real. Others caught glimpses, reflections in the glass, a shadow moving inside at dusk, a thread of smoke rising from a chimney that hadn't been used in years. People noticed Elijah began making trips to town twice a week instead of once. He bought more supplies, flour, beans, sugar, candles, enough for 2, but still he said nothing. What no one outside knew was that the girl had arrived in the night, barefoot and bloodied, knocking on the sealed vault door until her hands bled. Elijah, inside, hadn't answered at first. He watched her through the sight slits, saw the way she kept looking over her shoulder as if something had followed. She never screamed, never cried, just knocked and waited. He finally opened the door 23 minutes after the first knock. She said her name was Leah, gave no last name, offered no explanation. Elijah asked her one question. "Did they follow you?" She shook her head. That was all he needed. From that night on, she stayed in the stronghold. At first, Elijah considered it a risk. She might be a lure, a distraction, a weapon wrapped in innocent flesh. But within days, he realized she was something else entirely. She had the same haunted edge in her eyes, the same flinching reaction to movement, at the edge of vision. She checked the vents without being told. She never touched the door locks, but watched carefully as he sealed them. She slept in the sub-level by choice. Whatever had driven Elijah to build the fortress, she had seen it too. Together they made final preparations. Elijah installed perimeter wires connected to bells hidden beneath brush. He trained Leah on how to seal the chimney if smoke was a liability. They rigged oil lanterns on pivoting arms, so light could be thrown at multiple angles in the event of an incursion. They cleared brush back 30 yards from the structure in all directions, leaving only open ground, easy to monitor. In the trees, they placed mirrors, angled to reflect movement. The wind often gave false readings, but it was better than blindness. And in the nights that followed, both of them felt it, the return of that pressure, like a storm building somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the kind of stillness that makes animals go quiet and sends cold sweat down the spine for no reason at all. It wasn't a matter of if, it was when. Then came October 31st. The sky went strange. It wasn't storm clouds, not exactly. More like a bruising, darkness that spread not from overhead but from the horizon, a haze that ate light instead of casting shadows. Bitter wind went to bed early that night. People boarded windows, locked doors. Dogs refused to bark. On the outskirts of town, in the stronghold Elijah built from grief and foreboding, the final test was about to begin. It started at 1:17 a.m. A knock, not at the front vault door, but at the rear wall, a place with no entrance. Then another, not loud, not demanding, a tap, like before. Leah sat up in the sub-level. Elijah was already awake. He'd been watching the sightline mirrors. One of them, mirror 3, overlooking the south approach, had gone dark. not cracked, not fallen, just dark. He checked the perimeter wires, silent, no bells. He checked the chimney vent, still closed. Then another knock. This one closer, side wall, east, then silence. Elijah looked at Leah and said only one word, now. They began lockdown procedures. He sealed the sub-level hatch. She drew the blackout tarps. He closed the firebox damper and kicked sand over the remaining embers. They moved without panic, without hesitation. By 1:23, the entire stronghold was dark, silent, impenetrable. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but inside, two people sat in absolute silence, waiting for something that had come once before and promised to come again. And this time, it didn't knock to test. This time, it was looking for entry. The silence lasted for nearly half an hour, not the natural kind, the silence of sleep, of still wind, of long nightfall, but the deep, oppressive quiet that carries weight, that feels aware. Leah sat cross-legged near the sub-level wall, listening to every creak and echo. Her breathing was shallow. Above them, the heavy timbers of the floor groaned faintly as the temperature dropped. The air grew tight, as if the entire world outside had paused its motion to listen back. Elijah stayed seated near the ladder, his hand resting on the rifle laid across his knees. He didn't move for 25 minutes, not even when a faint scraping sound drifted through the timber above, like nails dragging slowly across bark. He just watched the small brass watch ticking on the wall and waited for the pattern to repeat. It did, precisely 3 minutes later, softer this time, but deliberate. 3 long scrapes, 1 pause, 2 shorter. A pattern, the same rhythm he'd heard 2 years earlier when those men circled the barn in the snow. The same rhythm that had haunted his sleep since. Leah whispered, "It's them!" Elijah didn't answer. He only shifted his grip on the rifle and tilted his head toward the iron ventilation shaft that led to the surface. A faint vibration trembled through it, metallic and thin. Something was testing the metal shutter. Not with force, not yet, just pressure, exploration, like fingers feeling for weakness. He mouthed, "Don't breathe." A moment later, the vibration stopped. The air seemed to exhale. Then, for the briefest heartbeat, came another sound. Footsteps, measured, heavy and slow, circling the perimeter above. Gravel underweight, not boots, not hooves, something heavier, dragging slightly, each step placed with mechanical patience. Elijah's heart pounded so loudly he feared it would echo through the walls. He had built those walls to defy force, to outlast storms and fire, but what pressed against them now felt beyond those measures. It wasn't the strength of what was outside that terrified him. It was its calm, the same calm those strangers had shown that first night, the calm of something that already knew the outcome. When the steps stopped, Elijah raised his hand to signal Leah. She crawled toward him in the dim lantern light. He leaned close and whispered into her ear, voice barely a breath. "Basement valve, left side. Close it." She obeyed, crawled across the dirt floor, feeling along the wall until her fingers brushed the cold iron handle of the pipe valve. She turned it slowly until it clicked. The stronghold sealed even tighter. No airflow, no scent, no sound escaping. Above them, something struck the east wall. Once, then twice. A low, dull thud that rattled dust from the beams. The reinforced braces held without shifting. Elijah counted silently in his head. 5 seconds between impacts. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to smash through. It was probing, testing, mapping the resistance the way a mason tests mortar strength. The third blow hit harder. The metal brackets groaned. Leah clutched her knees. Elijah stayed motionless. He knew what would come next. Silence again. Then another noise. A faint, almost human rhythm. Tap, pause. Tap, tap, like knuckles against wood. Elijah's eyes closed. That pattern had meaning. He didn't know what it said, but he knew it was language. He had heard it before the night his old barn fell. Heard it and ignored it because he hadn't believed something that strange could mean anything. This time he listened. It repeated, tap, pause, tap, 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 then quiet. He reached for the small pad of paper he kept near the ladder and scribbled the pattern down in marks, the way he had in the months after that first night when he'd tried to decode it by candlelight. He had pages of attempts buried somewhere in the structure, mathematical counts, rhythm charts, translations that led nowhere. But now, hearing it again exactly the same, he realized the message hadn't changed. Whatever was outside wasn't improvising. It was repeating protocol. He whispered to Leah, "It's not calling, it's measuring." Her eyes widened. "Measuring what?" He looked upward toward the ceiling, where dust drifted in the lantern light like snow. "The distance between what we are and what they're willing to cross." Before she could answer, the vent above the east wall gave a metallic shriek. The steel shutter bent inward half an inch before the bolts held. A thin stream of freezing air whistled through, bringing the scent of ozone and iron. Leah gasped, and covered her mouth. Elijah reached up and turned the release crank, dropping the emergency shield, a slab of iron that slammed over the vent from the inside. The echo rang through the chamber like a hammer on a coffin lid. Silence again, total. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It came through the thick timbers as a murmur, distorted, distant, like a human voice carried through water. Words blurred into one another, syllables slipping in and out of recognition. But one thing reached them unmistakably: a laugh, soft, low, male, the same kind of laugh Elijah had heard outside his old barn that night, just before they vanished. Leah whispered, "They're men." Elijah shook his head. They were. Another sound followed, the clatter of something rolling across the roof, a small metallic object, then a flash of light through the side slit, bright and white, lighting the chamber like lightning. The concussion hit half a second later, deafening, powerful, shaking dust from the rafters. The lanterns swung violently. Leah fell to her knees, ears ringing. Elijah crawled to the ladder and peered through the slit. Smoke curled upward outside, illuminated by the moon. The flash had scorched the outer siding, but the metal plates had held. He waited for the second blast. It never came. Instead, he heard the slow retreat of footsteps. One, then two, crunching on gravel, fading toward the ridge. He stayed frozen until even the echo disappeared. Only then did he speak. "They know," he said softly. "They know it holds." Leah stared at him, still shaking. "You think they'll stop?" He gave a hollow laugh. "No, now they'll study." For the rest of the night, they didn't move. At dawn, Elijah climbed the ladder and inspected the outer wall through a narrow periscope he'd built from mirrors. The damage was minimal, a blackened patch, a few bent bolts. But what he saw beyond the perimeter made his stomach twist. Across the field, 30 yards from the structure, someone, or something, had placed a marker, a wooden stake with a strip of cloth tied to it. The cloth was white at the top, red at the bottom. It fluttered in the wind like a flag of warning or claim. He took notes in his journal that morning. The entry, later found by another man decades afterward, read simply, "They marked it. First measure complete. Next, they will test ingress. Need more metal, need silence." For the next 2 days, Elijah didn't leave the stronghold. He dismantled his own house, stripped it of window frames, nails, hinges, anything that could reinforce the structure. He burned what he couldn't use. Leah helped without question. They melted down hardware in a makeshift forge built inside a trench behind the barn. He used the molten iron to pour new fittings for the braces. The stronghold became heavier, denser, darker. Even daylight seemed reluctant to enter. On the third day, the bells at the perimeter rang, once, then stopped. Elijah froze mid-stroke of the hammer. Leah ran to the slit. "Nothing," she whispered. "No movement." The bell rang again. Different direction this time. West, then again from the north. They were triggering them deliberately. He understood. They were mapping his defenses now, counting his distance, calculating response time. So he decided to answer in kind. He waited until nightfall, then lit no lamps. He moved through the dark by touch, following the exact paths he'd memorized. At the western slit, he pressed his eye to the glass. Nothing but starlight, then a flicker, brief, metallic, like moonlight glancing off glass or metal. He lifted his rifle, sighted, and fired. The shot tore through the silence, echoed across the valley. A spark erupted where the bullet struck, bright blue for an instant, then gone. Leah flinched at the sound. "You hit one?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "No, I hit something." When dawn came, the marker stake was gone. The bells were silent. But in their place, carved into the ground 20 paces from the door, was a symbol burned deep into the soil, a circle intersected by 3 lines, not written, etched, the grass around it singed, not from flame, but from heat too precise, too focused, for any tool Elijah owned. He didn't try to erase it, he just built over it, dragging a boulder to cover the mark. Some lines weren't meant to be crossed. The days that followed blurred into a tense rhythm. They slept in shifts, cooked only in the sub-level. Elijah wired makeshift alarms from copper and bells, then, dissatisfied, began designing a new device, something that would trigger a flare inside if light outside changed abruptly. Leah didn't question where he got the knowledge. She only helped solder the wires, and every night they heard the same sound somewhere out there. Metal scraping, not random, not chaotic, but steady, as if dozens of hands were constructing something unseen, answering Elijah's fortress with one of their own. By November's first snow, the land around the stronghold had changed. The grass was trampled flat in rings. Trees at the perimeter leaned outward, bark stripped in strange spirals. The sky itself felt lower, heavier, tinted faintly red even at noon. Leah began to dream. Every night the same vision, standing outside in moonlight, hearing tapping beneath her feet, and realizing the sound wasn't coming from above ground at all, but from below. She woke one night to find Elijah not in his cot. He was in the sublevel, kneeling beside the dirt wall, his ear pressed against the soil. "They're digging," he whispered. That was when he began building the floor traps, steel plates bolted over pressure springs, buried beneath false boards. If anything broke through from below, the plate would drop, sealing the gap with sand and stone. Primitive, but better than nothing. He worked feverishly, sleeping less, eating barely. His hands bled from hammerwork. Leah begged him to rest. He only said, "They can't take the ground. If they take the ground, they take us." Snow thickened. The wind turned raw. Bitter Wind's townsfolk, miles away, began to notice strange lights flickering on Elijah's ridge at night, orange glows that pulsed like breath, fading and returning. Some said lightning, others said reflections of fire from his forge. But one hunter swore he saw shapes moving in the light, figures walking in perfect synchronization, too far to be men, too precise to be chance. Then, one night, every bell on the perimeter rang at once. Elijah grabbed the rifle. Leah ran for the hatch. They sealed themselves inside. Above them, the sounds converged. Footsteps, thuds, scraping metal, the shriek of nails tearing free. The fortress shook as if an earthquake had struck. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then, without warning, the noise stopped. For 10 seconds, there was nothing. Then the first board split. It splintered not like wood worn by rot or age, but like bone under pressure. Sharp, loud and final. Elijah didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. For every sound, every failure point, he knew which wall had given way. He knew because it was the only one they hadn't rebuilt entirely after the flash burn weeks ago. The western lower brace behind the smoke-shielded hearth wall. The outer layer had taken damage he hadn't seen until it was too late to reinforce it properly without exposing the structure. He had told himself it could wait. It couldn't. Another crack followed, and then the groan of weight settling against timbers. Something was leaning, no pushing, against the external frame. The force wasn't desperate, wasn't violent. It was methodical, as if every pressure was calibrated to see how much weight the barn could bear before it caved in on itself. Inside the sublevel, Leah braced herself against the wall, one hand gripping a small crowbar, the other clutching the wire-strung bell switch Elijah had given her. If the floor gave way, if anything broke through, she was to pull that wire. That would trigger a mechanism above to collapse the ceiling and seal off the shaft. Elijah had drilled it into her again and again. "If I'm not down here when it starts, you pull." No hesitation. But she didn't want to pull it. She wanted him beside her. Up above, Elijah moved fast. He didn't panic. Didn't even speak. He grabbed a lantern, not for light, but for heat. It had been left burning low on purpose. He swung it to the heat sensor he had rigged beside the breech wall, the flare filament lantern trap, and shattered it against the stone floor. The sudden bloom of fire flashed against the copper coil embedded in the wall frame, and the coil, red hot in an instant, caused the expanding metal latches along the brace to snap outward. From outside, the intruders would hear nothing, but on the inside, Elijah heard the entire wall lock into its final position. Not airtight, not invisible, but sealed, reinforced, and, critically, wired. It wasn't a bomb. Elijah didn't have those. What he had was worse. A conductivity grid tied to 3 lead-acid batteries, and a salvage-wrapped copper wiring frame that charged every metal brace with a low but dangerous current. Anything that tried to break through now would get jolted from inside the wood itself. The wall shook again, then went still. He waited. A minute passed, then 5. Leah's voice came over the copper funnel near the hatch, her words barely a whisper, yet perfectly clear. "Is it done?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He stood perfectly still, eyes scanning the interior. A soft drip echoed from the ceiling, rain or meltwater maybe, but no more pressure from the walls. The bells had fallen silent. He opened the hatch and descended slowly. Leah's face was pale, smudged with soot and fear, but she wasn't crying. She looked at him and waited for the report. He nodded once. Wall held. She didn't smile, just leaned back against the cold earth wall and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. But Elijah wasn't done. He paced the sublevel, his mind already calculating what came next. That breach attempt hadn't been meant to break through. It had been a final test, a push to see what kind of response the fortress would offer. They'd felt the electricity. They'd heard the internal latches. They'd measured the response, and that meant the next phase was already in motion. "They know we've prepared," Elijah said. Leah was still catching her breath. "Then what now?" He looked at her. "Now they try something we haven't prepared for." That afternoon, Elijah emerged from the stronghold and scouted the perimeter. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early November. The snow had melted strangely near the walls, not from sunlight, but from heat, a low, residual warmth that lingered like steam over hot rocks. He moved in slow circles, his rifle slung but unraised. There were no tracks, no indentations, no sign of movement other than the stone itself, cracked in one place, burned in another. A pattern he didn't recognize but which reminded him of something mechanical, precise, geometric. It wasn't animal behavior. It wasn't man-made either. On the north side, he found a token, a smooth black object the size of a thumb, shaped like a seed or a shard of obsidian, but with metal filaments curling from the base like roots. He didn't touch it with bare hands. Instead, he scooped it into an iron bucket and brought it inside. Leah examined it under lantern light. "It looks grown," she said, voice thin. "Not made." Elijah said nothing, but inside, he agreed. It looked organic, manufactured by a will, but not by human hands. That night, he installed the final defense layer, the last card he had been holding back since he began construction. A one-way chimney system that vented not just smoke, but heat signatures through a buried channel 50 yards away, where it re-emerged as a false outlet built to resemble a collapsed storage hut. Anyone monitoring infrared or scent or other signals would find their attention drawn away from the actual building. Leah watched him work, her face tight with quiet dread. "They're not animals," she said suddenly. Elijah paused. "I don't mean wolves or men," she went on. "I mean whatever's out there. It watches, like it's listening to the ground or the air itself." He didn't deny it. "I think they want us to know they're out there." Leah stared at him. "Why?" Elijah stared out into the snowfield. "Because if we're afraid, we'll make mistakes, and they're counting on that." They waited again. For days, nothing came. The skies cleared. Bitter wind reported nothing unusual. No strange lights. No signs of trouble. Elijah almost convinced himself it was over. Until the 13th night, he awoke to a new sound. Not from outside, but from beneath. A scratching. Not loud, not urgent, but rhythmic. He climbed to the floor and pressed his ear to the wooden planks. The scratching repeated. He woke Leah. She came, listened, and paled. "It's under the wall," she whispered. Elijah nodded slowly. "They're testing the earth." That night they did not sleep. He began assembling the only countermeasure he had left, the mirror flare. He had been saving it for last, the most dangerous component of his defense, something he'd built using crushed magnesium flakes, silver nitrate, and copper powder sealed in a glass tube and placed in a concave metal bowl mounted on a rotating track. When triggered, it would fire a blinding light into a series of angled mirrors embedded around the property. The mirrors would catch and scatter the beam in all directions. A signal, yes, but also a weapon. Anything with eyes would be blinded. Anything that hunted by light distortion or line of sight would lose orientation. He'd spent weeks preparing it. Now he armed it. And then, without warning, the scratching stopped. No warning, no retreating footsteps. Just absence. That silence again. Elijah didn't lower his guard. He triple-sealed the hatch, rechecked the grounding wires for the electric current, and rewound the pulley that operated the ceiling collapse failsafe. If they were going to come again, this time they wouldn't walk the perimeter. They'd descend. By the next dusk, the temperature outside had dropped 20 degrees. The sun didn't rise fully the next day. It hovered on the horizon like an ember choked in smoke. Leah stirred the coals of their tiny cooking fire and asked, "Do you think anyone else sees what we see?" Elijah shook his head. "If they did, they're already gone." That night, something changed. No bells, no scratching, no knocks, but a hum, a low, barely audible hum, began to vibrate through the walls. Not through the air, but through the structure. Every metal fitting, every iron bolt began to buzz faintly, as if energized by a current not their own. It felt like standing near a telegraph line, but deeper, subsonic. Elijah covered the vents with lead shielding. Leah dug a trench inside the sublevel and filled it with water, hoping to ground the vibration. It didn't work. The sound didn't stop. It grew. By midnight, it was shaking the nails loose from the south wall braces. And then the light came, not from the sky, from beneath. A dull red glow seeped through the cracks in the floor, not as fire or lava, but as a pulse. It rose and fell in steady beats, illuminating the stronghold from below. Elijah grabbed Leah and pulled her to the sublevel. He shut the hatch behind them and braced the steel bars. The humming turned into pressure. Not noise, pressure, like something was expanding outward from the ground, a balloon pressing against the roots of the world. And in that moment, Elijah Hart knew the truth he had feared all along. This wasn't a siege. It was a harvest. They were never testing him. They were waiting for him to finish building the trap around himself. The red pulse from beneath continued, steady as a heartbeat. Every surface in the sub-level throbbed with it. The iron reinforcements in the walls vibrated faintly, not violently, but in that same unbearable, low-frequency hum that made the bones of your skull feel hollow. Elijah stood with his back pressed to the steel-braced hatch, sweat pouring down his temples despite the freezing air. Leah crouched near the far wall, her eyes locked on the dirt under her feet, as though afraid it might open and swallow her whole. Neither of them spoke. The pulsing glow illuminated the chamber from below the floorboards, but no flame, no visible source of light penetrated the cracks. It didn't make sense. Fire would flicker. This didn't. It rhythmed, like a signal, like breath, like thought. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. One beat, then another, then stillness. No sound, no hum, no heat, nothing. Leah whispered, "Elijah?" But before she could finish, the sound returned, not from below this time, but from inside the walls, a sharp clicking like chittering teeth, followed by a slow scraping along the metal braces. Elijah raised his rifle. It was pointless, he knew that, but the feel of the stock against his shoulder gave him a sense of order, of control. The sound moved through the wall studs like a creature pacing within the bones of the structure. "What are they doing?" Leah asked, barely audible. He didn't answer at first. He moved toward the eastern brace, the one with the embedded copper sound funnel he had crafted months ago for just this kind of breach. He placed his ear to it. He heard whispering, not language, not words, breath, something mimicking human speech but filtered through a layer of wrongness, like hearing your own voice played back too slowly, too distorted. There were intonations, repetitions. It circled one sound over and over again, a low syllabic ka, ka, ka. Then a sudden knock from the southern wall made him recoil. Leah screamed and crawled back. The knock wasn't on the surface. It came from between the walls, inside the dead space. They were in the walls now. Elijah moved fast. He dropped his rifle and pulled the main switch for the perimeter current. A faint spark leapt from the copper junction. He had hardwired every metal support to that switch, banking that if anything made it through the exterior walls, it would still have to contend with the metal skeleton of the structure. But the sound didn't stop. It intensified. Now it wasn't just a knock. It was footsteps. Inside, heavy, wet thumps, moving methodically through the cavity of the walls, as if the entire barn had become a hollow body and something was crawling through its veins. Leah covered her ears and began to sob, her shoulders convulsing. Elijah turned to her, grabbed her face between his hands and whispered, "We're not dead. We're not done. Focus. But I built this for a reason. If they're inside, that means they think they've won. They're overconfident now, and that's the only chance we've got." He grabbed a lantern and shattered it against the ground. The oil spread fast, and he tossed a flare from his pocket. The sublevel lit up in a flash of blue-orange light, the flame licking across the stone-lined floor and toward the base of the wall where the sounds were thickest. The oil ignited along the wall. The sound inside stopped. A silence fell so deep it choked the oxygen from the room. Then came the shriek, not from an animal, not from a man, something in between. It vibrated every nail in the floorboards, sent plaster crumbling from the low ceiling. Leah dropped to her knees, covering her ears again, blood dripping from her nose. Elijah kicked aside a storage crate and yanked open the secondary hatch, the one he had kept hidden, even from Leah. It led to a crawl shaft that tunneled beneath the entire structure and out the far side of the ridge. An escape tunnel. He had built it in case the stronghold failed. In case he failed. He turned to Leah and pulled her to her feet. "We have to move, now." "But the walls!" "They're in them, which means they'll break through soon." They crawled through the narrow passage one at a time, Elijah leading, his rifle slung across his back, a coil of wire looped over his shoulder. He didn't explain the wire. Leah didn't ask. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for shoulders, but it was stable, reinforced with timber and packed clay. It angled downward for 20 feet before leveling off, then rose again toward a concealed exit hidden beneath a collapsed section of fence near the tree line. It had taken Elijah 3 months to dig it, working by lamplight, afraid even then that it might not be enough. They reached the end. Elijah pushed open the hatch with a slow grunt. Snow had covered it, but not much, just a dusting. He climbed out and helped Leah up. They stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the view of the barn. Elijah turned. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The barn glowed red, not fire, not flame. It glowed from within, as if something had turned the walls translucent. Shadows moved inside, tall, angular things that didn't walk so much as flow from place to place. Their limbs were too long, their heads too smooth. No faces, no mouths, just presence. And then, just as quickly, the light vanished, the shadows with it. Only the barn remained, silent and dark. Leah gasped. "What are they?" "I don't know, but they're inside." "Yes." He didn't lower his eyes, didn't blink. "They've claimed it." She looked at him, horror dawning. "Then we're trapped out here." Elijah finally turned. "No, they are." He knelt, pulled the wire from his shoulder, and attached it to a small post driven into the ground near the hatch. It was a detonator, not for dynamite, but for the interior voltage system he had rigged weeks earlier. The batteries had been charging for months. He had no idea if it would work, but if it did, it would supercharge the metal infrastructure of the barn, turning every nail, every brace, every plate into a conduit. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. Then the barn lit up like a forge. Blue lightning cracked from the base to the rafters. The walls pulsed with energy. From inside came no sound, no movement, no scream, only silence. Then the light collapsed inward, folding like a dying star. The barn imploded, not with noise, but with absence. The walls buckled inward, the roof dropped, and in one breathless instant the structure vanished into itself. No explosion, no debris, just dust. Leah stood frozen. Elijah fell to one knee. They waited for the shriek, the retaliation, the surge of movement from the trees. Nothing came, only snow, only silence. He pulled the detonator wire back and coiled it slowly, his hands shaking. Leah whispered, "Did it work?" Elijah stared at the crater where the barn had stood. A black hole, smooth-edged, no splinters, no rubble, just missing. "I don't know," he said, because in truth he didn't. He had spent 2 years building a fortress, preparing for an attack, defending himself against something he didn't understand, and in the end the structure had held. But something else had gotten in, something that had waited, something that had let him build it, because it wanted a door, and maybe, just maybe, that door had now been opened. Elijah Hart didn't speak for 3 days. He and Leah moved west, away from the crater, following the edge of the forest, where the pine needles muffled their steps, and the air held the scent of resin and frost. They didn't speak because there was nothing to say, not yet. The silence wasn't heavy with fear, but with unfinished thoughts, suspended between what they'd seen and what they now feared might follow. Elijah wasn't sure what he'd done. He had built a stronghold, he had held the line, and then he had triggered something that wasn't meant to be touched, ignited something that did not burn so much as vanish. On the 4th day, they reached a low ridge near a dry creek bed and made camp. It wasn't a safe place. There were no safe places now, but it had line of sight in 3 directions, and a bend in the terrain that muffled sound. Elijah fashioned a lean-to from pine branches and wrapped it in canvas while Leah boiled water over a twig fire, watching the perimeter. Her eyes never stopped moving. She had changed since the night of the implosion. Something in her posture had settled into that same alert stillness Elijah had carried for years. He saw it now in her, the recognition of pattern, the waiting for a shape in the shadows that never came but always hovered near. On the 5th morning, Elijah climbed to the ridge crest and looked back toward Bitterwind. Smoke still rose from the town, thin, normal, no sign of panic or fire. The town hadn't seen what they had seen. Whatever visited the barn hadn't visited anyone else, or had done so quietly. He studied the sky. It was still wrong. It wasn't cloudy, nor clear. It simply lacked dimension. The massed clouds no longer moved with the wind. They hung there, stagnant and low, like a painted ceiling whose depth had been pressed down against the world. He counted the clouds. They didn't change, not in shape, not in location, like someone had pinned them in place. He didn't tell Leah. He didn't want to say out loud that the sky itself might be watching. By noon, he started writing again, not in his old ledger. He had left that inside the barn, knowing full well it might never leave. He wrote on scraps, on torn bits of parchment, on lengths of canvas he scorched and scratched words into with burnt sticks. He recorded what he'd seen, what he'd built, and, most urgently, what had changed afterward. Because something had changed. The animals told him first, not in words, not even in behavior, in absence. No birds circled, no tracks marked the snow, no fox calls, no owls. The woods had become sterile, silent, like the space around the barn had spread outward in all directions, seeding silence. Elijah remembered the way his father had once described the moments before a tornado touched down. Not the wind, but the stillness before it. The world takes a breath, he'd said, and if it doesn't exhale, you run. The world was still holding its breath. Leah noticed it too. At dusk on the 6th day, she pointed to a place in the trees where no snow had fallen, not a melted patch, just a perfectly round space, 12 feet across, where the snow had simply not touched the ground. No tracks led to it, no wind explained it. It was like something had hovered there, just long enough to mark its absence. "Are they following?" she asked. Elijah didn't answer, because he didn't know. That night they lit no fire. They wrapped themselves in wool and kept low. The moon hung strangely, like a pale coin. It was too large. The shadows it cast were too sharp. It made the trees look etched in black ink. Elijah lay awake with his rifle across his chest, listening for the sounds of something returning. But it wasn't the night that brought the next sign. It was the morning. On the 7th day, Leah found something buried in the frost, a piece of iron, not shaped, not forged, melted, half of a bolt, one of his own, from the barn. Fused to it was a thin sliver of glass, not window pane, not lantern, something more delicate, curved, transparent but filled with spiderweb threads of copper and silver that sparked in the morning light. Elijah took it, turned it over, and saw the pattern burned into its underside. A circle, intersected by 3 lines. The same mark they had etched outside the barn. The same mark he had buried beneath a boulder and never told Leah about. Now it had returned. This time, not burned into soil. This time made from his own materials, from his own hand. He buried it again without speaking. Deep this time. In stone, not dirt. Because he knew what it meant. The barn was gone. But it wasn't destroyed. It had been taken, not blown apart, not burned down, removed, disassembled on a molecular level, studied, altered, and now the pieces were coming back, one by one, carrying messages he couldn't read. That night, they moved again, further west, into the hills. Leah asked him what he was looking for. He said, "A place with no echoes." She frowned. Echoes of what? He didn't answer. Not yet. 2 days later, they crossed a narrow gorge and found what he'd been looking for, a collapsed mining claim from 30 years back. The shaft had caved, but the foundation stones remained, half buried and black with moss. More importantly, the gorge acted as a natural funnel for wind and sound. Elijah had tested it with a whistle. The sound vanished, swallowed by the terrain. No echoes. They set up camp in the stones, and that's when he began to build again. Not a barn, not a stronghold, a chamber, no walls, no roof, just a spiral of standing stones carved from broken slabs he pried from the old mine tailings. He laid them in a perfect curve, spacing them by hand, checking their alignment with stars and sun. Leah didn't understand at first, but she helped. "What's it for?" she asked one night. Elijah stared at the center, at the bare earth surrounded by ringed stone. "It's a question," he said. "To who?" "To whatever answered the last one." He never finished explaining, because the next morning the birds came back, a single crow, then 2, then the rabbits, the mice, a fox, not many, but enough to prove something had changed. The silence was receding. The question now was, why? Elijah sat in the center of the stone spiral that night and closed his eyes. He didn't speak, he only listened, and in that deep stillness, he felt something brush his thoughts. Not a word, not a vision, a presence, watching, not malevolent, not friendly, just present. It didn't knock, it didn't test, it simply waited, and for the first time in years, Elijah Hart felt something he hadn't expected. Pity, because if it was still watching, then it was still trying, and it had not yet succeeded, which meant the door had not been opened. But the key was no longer in his hands. He opened his eyes. Leah was watching him. She asked, "Is it over?" He looked to the stars, which had begun to shimmer again. Not pulse, not glow, just shimmer, like stars are supposed to do. He nodded. For now, but he didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the spiral until dawn. Because something had learned from the barn. Something had watched every nail, every brace, every plate. Something had understood the purpose of a stronghold, and it had let him build it, not to keep something out, but to show what it would take to let something in. There are men who survive the wilderness because they respect it, others because they bend it to their will. Elijah Hart had done both. He had lived through hunger, blizzards, wildfire, and grief. He had walked the bitter edge of the world and built a refuge, not just for the body, but for the soul. But in the end, what he built was not a refuge. It was a mirror held up to something watching from the dark. The barn was never meant to stand forever. It was meant to be understood, and now it had been. 3 weeks after the implosion, Elijah stood in the spiral again. The snows had returned in light flurries, dusting the tops of the standing stones. Each stone bore shallow etchings now, simple grooves made by hand, a language of weight and gesture. He had no alphabet for it, no map, only instinct. He carved in silence. Leah watched without interrupting. Sometimes she brought him water. Sometimes she sat near the edge and wrote in her own ledger, chronicling the days, the pattern of weather, the way the stars no longer pulsed unnaturally. She didn't ask about the barn anymore, neither did Elijah, not because they had forgotten, but because it was over, or so they thought, until the boy came. He arrived at dusk, barefoot in the snow, with no pack and no coat, 12, maybe 13 years old, with sunken eyes and knotted hair. He didn't speak. He simply stood at the edge of the spiral and waited. Elijah walked toward him slowly, hands open. The boy extended his arm. In his palm was a shard of wood, smooth, burnished. Elijah took it. It was one of the inner braces from the barn, still warm, not just physically, but recent. Elijah turned it over. Beneath the grain, carved in something finer than any tool could produce, was the same mark, the circle and the 3 lines. But this time, there was a 4th line, vertical, bisecting the circle. The symmetry had changed. Elijah's throat dried. "Where did you find this?" he asked. The boy didn't answer. But Leah, watching from the stones, saw his lips move. Just one word. "Below." Elijah looked back at him. "Below where?" The boy pointed. "Not east, not west, down." Elijah didn't sleep that night. He laid the brace piece on the ground inside the spiral, studied it until the moon passed directly overhead, and turned the etching silver in the frostlight. The fourth line. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew what it suggested: change, progression, an answer, or a challenge. He thought back to the night it all began. Not the implosion, not even the night those figures circled the barn. Earlier than that, the night he first stood by his wife's bed and realized he could no longer protect what mattered. That was the real beginning, the moment powerlessness became obsession. That was when he began building, not the barn, but the idea of it, a structure that could withstand the world. But the world had changed, and now something else was building too. The next day, Elijah and Leah left the ridge. They didn't say goodbye to the stones. They didn't pack. They left the spiral intact, the etchings facing inward. They headed west, toward the jagged hills, into the shale-strewn lands where even the wind didn't travel freely, places where men didn't settle, where the stars at night looked different, sharper, somehow more ancient. They passed an abandoned telegraph line. The poles had rotted, the wire hung in rusted loops. Leah touched one of them. It hummed faintly under her fingers. She looked at Elijah. He nodded. They're still listening. They found the next site on the third day. An old ranger station collapsed into itself, half swallowed by time. Elijah stood at the edge of the ruin and squinted against the wind. "No one will come here," Leah said. "Good," he replied. He pulled a knife from his coat and began clearing the debris, stone by stone, until only the foundation remained. He measured the perimeter with steps, not looking for size but resonance, where sound died, where shadow fell, where the wind bent, and then with a stick and a string, he marked the first circle. Not for a barn, not for a fortress, not even for a home, for something new, not a defense, not a wall, a language, one the watchers might understand, because the message wasn't "keep out" anymore. The message was, "we see you now." And if they were going to return, Elijah would be ready to answer. Not with guns, not with traps, but with something the watchers didn't expect. Understanding. That was the real stronghold, not the barn, not the structure, the mind that built it. A man who could endure grief, terror, loss, and still stand, still carve meaning into stone, still ask why. That was what they had failed to destroy. That was what they would never control. Elijah Hart wasn't building for survival anymore. He was building for contact. Whatever came next, it would not find him cowering in a sealed room. It would find him standing in the open, eyes clear, hands calloused, heart steady, not afraid, ready.